Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another book review from the Goosebumps Series 2000 book series. And it's book number 20, Be Afraid, Be Very Afraid. Now, I'm going to be upfront and honest with you all. I got to get something off my chest here. I'm not a fan of this book whatsoever. I read this book one time when I was younger, maybe around the age of 10, and I did not like it whatsoever. And I've always had a bad taste in my mouth over this book throughout the years, whenever I think back on it. And I was kind of dreading getting to this for review purposes. But since I'm trying to get caught up in reviews and knock out the stuff that I have left with Goosebumps so I can move on to some other kids' horror stuff, this was on the list. And I thought, why not go ahead and read it now? And I'll say this up front. I see a lot of people putting this book in the bottom 5 of Series 2000. And I totally 100% agree with people's opinions about this book when it comes to Series 2000 as a whole. In my opinion, if you ask me, there are two prominent camps in the Goosebumps community. There's people that think the OG 62 is better, and then there's people that think that Series 2000 is better overall. I will say this. I will take this book over a lot of the ones that I find to be some of the worst of original 62 all day long. However, that does not make this book good in comparison at all. If I had to say anything before we get any further into the plot overview and all that, this is a very weak entry in the Goosebumps series. This is one of those Series 2000 books. You know, when you think about the series as a whole, it was known for having the first two-parter ever, and that was Invasion of the Body Squeezers, Part 1 and Part 2. And I mentioned this back in the Werewolf in the Living Rooms review a long time ago now, that book could have benefited from a two-parter or at least a special edition to flesh out its concept a whole lot better and fix some pacing issues. This book is no different from Werewolf in the Living Room, but it does have a lot more weaknesses to point out, unfortunately for its case. But this is another one of those that definitely needed maybe 160, 170 pages to fully go through with the concept Stein was trying to pull off here, or at least a two-part book, because that's what they were doing in the series at the time. Would it have been good as a two-parter? I don't know, but hopefully it would have fixed a lot of some issues that I'm going to bring up later on in the review portion. So off the bat, do I recommend Be Afraid, Be Very Afraid? Not really. I don't recommend this book at all to people unless you are looking for a different type of Goosebumps tale that you don't really see at all in modern Goosebumps, because if we're being honest, modern Goosebumps is full of rehashes and formulas that have been used over and over again at this point for the most part. But this one does kind of defy that. It's really only borrowing from one tale that I've come across heavily, and that is the Haunted House game from Tales to Give You Goosebumps Book 3. There's multiple versions of it, but this is like the book version of that. If you're not curious to check out what that would have looked like as a full book, don't worry about it, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So, the story starts off with this kid named Connor. He and his friend Emily are bored one day. It's on the weekend. They're looking for something to do. And they see this garage sale in their neighborhood, I guess a couple streets over, from this old man who's like gray in the hair or like full on white hair, white beard type of guy. Seems to hate kids and have a vendetta against Connor and his friend Emily. And they want to go check out the yard sale and see what he's selling, right? So they go there, and the guy's being a jerk to them and pretty much kicks them out. But before they could leave, they end up stealing, or Connor ends up stealing, a deck of cards that was on this table at the yard sale. And when they get back to Connor's house, him and Emily are, talking, and Connor's like, well, I took this as a souvenir, and it's like a role-playing deck of cards that kind of looks like those games that you can get from like game stores, not like video game stores, but like, card shops, board game shops type of thing, right? And then their friend Kyle comes over, who's like this football player, athlete, jock type, who happens to be into nerdy things. He recognizes it as, a card game that has like a medieval style to it, and it might be fun to play. So the three of them sit down and open the game, and the game is called Be Afraid. And the game has different types of cards. They have like character cards, where if you pick a card, you get to be the character throughout the whole game that you're playing with your friends. It's meant to be played with multiple people. You have power cards, which dictate how powerful your character is going to be. And then you have like like fate cards. I think that's what they're called, where something happens to them, like you can like get captured, get killed, eaten, whatever the case may be, right? So they start playing the game, and Connor ends up drawing a king card. I think Kyle ends up drawing a creature card known as a Krell, and then Emily draws a card of another creature, but later on she ends up swapping to another one, and we'll get into that in a moment here. But Connor, he's this king, and he's figuring out how to play the game with his friends. He's rolling some dice. He ends up acquiring an army of people, and then the fate card says that his army is going to attack a nearby castle. So when this happens, something might happen in the real world to kind of reflect this. This is what the concept is going for. This is how it's linked to the haunted house game, where the kids, they find this board game, and everything that happens on the board game happens outside their house or inside their house, etc. But before that, Connor was picking up some cards, and he picked up like a lightning bolt card, which started a lightning storm outside, like a thunderstorm. And he swears that he saw this old man who's named Mr. Zarwood. Yes, Zarwood. It's like an anagram for wizard, right? And that plays a role later on. But he thinks he sees him, and he gets kind of creeped out. And they pull another card, and then the lights go out. It turns pitch black. And Connor very quickly, unlike his friends, catch on to these cards are, causing stuff to happen in the real world. So going back to his army card and attacking the nearby castle, they heard this commotion outside, which alarms Connor, but his friends seem kind of unfazed by it. And when he goes to go check it out, like he hears all this commotion outside, and he goes to investigate it. It looks like something has happened to his neighbor's house. And the reason why they did that was because Connor's parents came home, mentioned something about the neighbor's house. The kids go outside and look, and Connor's like, yeah, these cards must have did this to, the neighbors. We got to return these cards before anything gets too bad, right? But the neighbor, Mr. Zarwood, happened to oversee or hear what happened in the neighborhood, and confronts Connor and says, hey, you were at the yard sale. Did you by any chance steal these cards? And he's like, no, we didn't do it. And I think beforehand there was another altercation where he tried to confront the kids about it. And after this point, Connor's like, well, I don't care what my friends say, I'm going to have to give them back and try to muster up the courage to tell the truth. Well, Connor goes to sleep that night after his friends leave, and he has this dream where he's confronted in a random dream sequence of Mr. Zarwood in like a white robe, like he's Ganon from Lord of the Rings, and he has these interactions with these creatures inside the card game and whatnot. It doesn't really matter or anything, but it's more of a prophetic thing to kind of reinforce that he needs to get these cards back. But he gets woken up in the morning to his friends already downstairs in his house, ready to play the game. And his friends aren't taking no for an answer after Connor's like, no, we shouldn't have played. We got to return them. So he ends up just saying, fine, we'll play a little bit more. Maybe to convince himself that all of this stuff happened due to a random lightning storm that his friends said that was just a coincidence with the cards. And, the lights going out was just a product of the lightning storm and all that. But very quickly, him and his friends realized that his original premonition was true. His friend Emily, when it's her turn to play, she ends up switching to this dragon card. And this dragon ends up coming outside of the house that they're playing the game in and is causing a bunch of commotion, leaving, massive, wakes of damage in its wake. And the kids are trying to figure out how to stop the dragon. But before they can do that, his friend Kyle decides to play his turn, and he's a Krell, and he's decided to partner up with Emily, who's the dragon, and there's an army of elves that have like nets that have put Connor's army, because he's the king and he has his own personal army, out of commission to stop the dragon. So they soon realize, after looking outside and seeing all these creatures, that there needs to be something to stop the dragon. So Connor tries to summon another army, and because he rolled a certain amount of die, numbers on the die that he rolled, it only summoned like 5 soldiers, and they can't do anything about it. So the kids realize that these cards are actually, what Mr. Zarwood was warning, that this isn't a game, this is something to be taken serious. And they decide to try to put the cards back into the box. And upon doing so, it seems that all the things they have summoned into the real world have vanished. So then, once they do that, they decide to take the box to Zarwood's house. And after they go to Zarwood's house, they end up kind of breaking into his home because they hear some like weird laughter. And they have this odd altercation with him. And Zarwood kind of says to them like, oh, so since you stole the cards, you now have to be punished. And essentially sends them into the card game itself because they knew too much information. And what information they knew is never really explained, but it's more implied that Zarwood might have been a character in the game that has somehow let himself live on in the real world. I guess that's what it's implying, right? So they end up getting sent to this world inside the card game. And the 3 of them, from this point, have to go through this ordeal of dealing with like Krells, jackals, and various creatures that were mentioned on the cards, right? And they come to an altercation where they plead that they're not, magical beings or sorcerers, and these creatures decide to test them by making them drink poison. And to avoid drinking poison, they get saved by a chance happening that allows them to escape into this field of corn stalks. And the corn stalks themselves are revealed to be a new creature that they haven't come across in the card game yet. But before we can figure out what's going to happen next, there's a line in bold on the bottom of like page 80 something that says, "You finished the story." After that, it goes full on meta, where those characters are now cast aside and a brand new main character is put into the forefront named Mark. And Mark and his sister Amy are chilling at their own house, and Mark's upset that he's reading this sorcery book, and he's reading about these kids, Connor, Kyle, and Emily, getting these cards from this guy, and the story abruptly ends before they find out what happens next. And Mark's upset, and Amy's like, well, why don't you just stop reading the book since they're all the same thing anyway? You kind of already can expect where they're going to go. And Mark's like, well, that's not the point. This just proves that the writer's lazy. And I think it's kind of Stein's own admission saying that this part of the book is very lazy. But nonetheless, Amy kind of shows Mark that there's some cards included with the book. And they decide to start messing around with the cards, and the cards themselves say, "Be afraid" on it. And you would think that Mark would have remembered these cards from the book, but he doesn't really, and just goes along with Amy and says, hey, why don't we play with these? And when they start playing it, some things that mirrored what happened in the book starts happening. And before they know it, they find themselves sucked into the card game. And they're, I guess, in the same area where Connor, Emily, and Kyle were. And they end up running into the 3 of them after trying to run away from these creatures. And there's a scene where, I don't want to spoil it because it plays a role. But after avoiding that, they come across the other 3 kids. And they're essentially all 5 of them are captured, right? And they're led to a certain part of this world that they're in now. And before we can find out whatever happens to them, we get another "You finish the story." And we get another character named Brenda to send off the final chapter of the book, kind of making it like a loop going on of meta-ness. And that's how Be Afraid, Be Very Afraid ends in a nutshell. I don't want to spoil like the meat of what happens in the, I guess, multiple climaxes here, but that's what you're going to expect from this type of book here. So yeah. Wow. Okay. So this book was a little bit rough in its delivery, but I do have some positives with it, and I want to mention them here. I think the first 80 or so pages before we get the first "you finish the story" was very well written in the sense that it's one of those descriptive books, kind of like The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, or some other books out there that have very rich prose or prose. I say it funny, but you know what I mean. There's just a lot of description, and it is very easy to read. I would say the first 80 or so pages are very easy to read because of that. You get a clear painting in your head of what's happening to these kids. And honestly, it's very fun in an adventurous type of way. This is like how Give Yourself Goosebumps books operate in like good arcs of those stories, right? So you have like these very action focused subplots or A or B plots going on in those books that are styled similarly to this. And I think it works. And I can definitely see where Stein was going with this, because in the heart of it, I can definitely see him wanting to borrow that, because when you're dealing with like a medieval adventure book, Give Yourself Goosebumps was like the longest running book series at the time this book was made. So I guess he thought that incorporating that might help the delivery of this book. And I do think that it worked for those pages when the care was put there. So that was a tremendous positive. And I do like this as a positive as well. The Haunted House Game is one of my favorite short stories from the Tales to Give You Goosebumps series, and it's one of my favorite episodes from the show. In seeing a full book, or an attempt at a full book of this, concept of sorts, was fun to see. I would have preferred maybe like a horror game version than a strictly medieval version like this was. But the monsters were fun, and there are some creepy moments and some legitimate implications of stakes to be had with these kids as they're going through this card game of sorts in the first 80 or so pages, and I really dug that. So yeah, those are two really strong positives. I definitely think that this book is better written than most of the F and D minuses, if not all of them, that I've covered so far on this channel. And because of that, it definitely warrants a lot of points in my book. However, this book is not without its clear, humongous flaws. And I've already kind of brought this up in the beginning of the video. The pacing and the structure of this book is atrocious. Okay? Kind of similarly to The Werewolf in the Living Room. The problem with that book was you had two distinct parts of the book where both kind of suffered because they weren't given the page room to be fleshed out. And this book, the pacing is all over the place because it's just nonstop action pretty much from the get-go. And because of that, and because of what this book is trying to do with being meta and you doing the whole you finish the story stuff, picking up different characters, the different character part, the final 20, 30 pages, gets so rushed over that it makes me think that if Stein really wanted to pull this whole idea off, at least the idea we got with this book, it would have benefited from maybe a part 1 and part 2. Part 1 should have been Connor's story arc with his friends, Kyle and Emily, and fleshing that out, fleshing their characters out more, which is my second negative, and I'll get into that in just a minute. Making a more solid story with them, cliffhanging on the you finish the story with Mark and Amy, and then part 2 should have picked up with Mark and Amy, flesh that story out with them, have them converge, and have some connections to Zarwid's yard sale and all that, and it would have made a lot more sense. But I digress. The whole delivery and the construction of this book is a sloppy mess. Okay. And yeah, it's going to be a huge evident thing for a lot of you out there. The second thing is the complete lack of characterization in this book. You don't really care about any of these characters because they're not given any time to be fleshed out. Their personalities are basically written down to brief descriptions and sentences early on in the book, and they're never touched on again. Yeah, these characters suck, and not in like the bad way where they're just unlikable. They're just not written in any meaningful way. So that most of the time in Goosebumps, you can latch on to a character's personality or that, this or that. Here, the only thing you can latch on with Connor being the narrator of the first portion of the book is the fact that he has regrets of stealing something and that he wants to return these cards. It's about as cardboard as you can get with characters that I've come across in Goosebumps. Whether we're talking main characters, the whole cast, the whole 9 yards, this wins it. Characters, very mediocre, if not below average, even for Goosebumps' standards. So, yeah, characters are very weak. And the third thing, oh my lord, is how bafflingly unorganized it is with the whole Zarwood thing and how that plays into the whole story, connecting these characters. It's so thrown together because Stein, I guess, had a quota to meet with this book. And because he wasn't going to be given a special edition or two-parter, he had to just make things fit. And you can clearly tell there is a delineation between the connection of Connor and his friend group to Mark and his sister Amy. It just doesn't feel organic. It doesn't really resemble much of anything with Mark, because you're like, okay, where did he get this book from? You know, if you would have said that the book came from Zarwood's yard sale and maybe it was Zarwood's construction all along to, you know, get revenge on these kids throughout the neighborhood that pester him or annoy him, then that would make sense why Mark got the book. Or, you know, that makes sense why Connor got punished for stealing the cards. But it's not there. It's not there. And the whole thing with Zarwood is so implied. You don't know what he is, but you get the sense that he is magic and he's possibly associated with these cards. But it's never outright said that that is the case. So even with Zarwood, you don't even feel like you get a proper conclusion with that. You know, there's so much open ends. I mean, so many open ends with this story that by the end of it, you're just like, but why does all this matter? And as a reader, you know, you don't want to leave the audience scratching their heads and saying, what did I just read? And that's how I feel about this book overall. You know what I mean? It's a bafflingly unorganized, sloppy mess. It has a fun concept going for it, and that's the sad part. You know, this could work, just not with 118 pages that Stein provided here. So, from a 0 to 5 star basis, was this book good? No. So it's getting less than a 3.5. But was it bad? I'll say this. Like I said, it has better writing capabilities than most of the D- books, if not all of them. So I can't bring myself to give this below a 3 either. I don't think it's bad. I just think it's very meh. So I'm like in the lower end of like a 3 out of 5 stars for this. And where I settled with this was a flat 3 out of 5 stars. This feels very similar to how I feel about books like Dr. Maniac versus Robbie Schwartz. You have a fun idea, you have some fun glimpses of actual good things to be had in the story, but where it falls apart is the construction and the execution. And this is a clear example of that. This needed to be retooled badly. I'm kind of baffled of how this was able to be put out in its condition it was in. But then again, when I'm thinking about, like, especially from books 17 through the end of Series 2000, it feels like these were just kind of rushed out because Stein would just stop caring. And almost all of them have terrible endings. Almost all of them. Now, is this one of the worst endings of Goosebumps history? Yes, given the context that this is its own standalone book, it's not building into a second part. Absolutely. I think the final 20 or 30 pages of this book arguably can go down in the history of Goosebumps as some of the worst ways to wrap up a Goosebumps book ever. And if there's any book to ever look to of how not to wrap up a story, it's this one. You can tell that Stein was trying to experiment. I can give him some props. And that is also a mild positive. I do appreciate the swing, but you really missed the ball here, Stein. And that's sad. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Be Afraid, Be Very Afraid. Let me know down in the comment section if you've read this book before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.